Okay, so let's talk about what just happened in Manipur. Tens of thousands of people literally flooded the streets. We're going to dive into the story of their march and uncover why they're saying it's about so much more than what you might have heard.
So, what was their message? Well, the organizers framed this whole crisis in a very specific way, and you really have to understand it to get what's going on. They're calling it a proxy war. And this really gets to the heart of their entire argument. The people marching pushed back hard against the common narrative, the one that just calls it ethnic tension. Instead, they're arguing that this crisis is a direct result of Indian government policy, which they claim has turned their home into a managed conflict zone to deliberately keep things unstable.
And that feeling of endless instability is so key here. By the time this march happened, the crisis had been dragging on for 32 months. 32. You can just feel the exhaustion and the frustration in a number like that. People felt the situation wasn't getting better because the government wasn't actually trying to fix it. This quote from Y.K. Dhiren, one of the main organizers, just lays it all out there. He's directly accusing the Indian government of, in his words, providing fuel to armed groups. Now, these groups are part of something called a suspension of operations, or SOO agreement. So the core belief here, what they're saying, is that the state itself is actually enabling the very conflict it's supposed to be stopping. But the protest wasn't just about government policy. Oh, no. It also dragged a really sensitive and controversial debate about identity right into the spotlight. And wow, this is a truly jaw-dropping statement. Michael Lumjathong Hokip, a leader from the indigenous Thadu community, got up and said this at the rally. He is basically arguing that the very word kuki is a dangerous mistake that's actually making the conflict worse. So here's the distinction he was trying to make. On the one hand, he says you have the true indigenous peoples of the land, groups like his own, the Tatho, plus the Paiti, Vaife, and Hamar. But then on the other hand, he defines the Kukis not as an ethnic group at all, but as a political label for what he calls separatist foreigners who want to break Manipur apart. And to back this up, he pointed to a history of conflict in the area, linking a series of clashes over the decades to this group he calls Kukis. So he's basically arguing that the current violence with the Métis community isn't some new thing, but just the latest chapter in a much longer story. Okay, so you're dealing with this long crisis and these really deep grievances. What do you do? Well, the march itself was the answer. It was designed to be this massive, unified demonstration to force everyone in the country to pay attention. And you can really feel that sense of unity here. You see the main banner for the organizers, COCOMI, leading the way. But then you look closer at the crowd, it's not just one type of person. You see so many women, elders, and young people all out there marching together for one single reason. And I mean, just look at how diverse this crowd was. You had people who'd been forced out of their homes, these powerful women's groups known as the Mira Pabais, students, artists, members from various communities like the Métis Pongals. It was a true coalition of the willing. But a protest this big can't just be about making noise, right? It needs a goal. And in this case, the march ended with a huge public meeting where they came up with 8 specific resolutions, 8 demands. Their number one demand? Well, it goes right back to the central theme of this whole movement. They called for an immediate stop to what they call India's proxy war policy and for a total cancellation of that suspension of operations agreement with armed groups. They see that as the root of the entire problem. And their other demands were just as specific. They want a safe and quick return for everyone who's been displaced. They want so-called narco-terrorist networks dismantled. They're calling for a National Register of Citizens, or NRC, to deal with illegal immigration and for guaranteed safety on the highways, all while making sure Manipur's territory stays intact. And this was the backdrop for the whole thing. In the middle of this enormous civilian protests, there was a heavy presence of state security forces. It really captures the tension of the moment, doesn't it? You have a people's movement unfolding right under the watchful eye of the very state they're protesting against. So the people have spoken, loudly and clearly. They've laid out their side of the story, their pain, and their demands. The crucial question now is, what happens next? With these resolutions officially on the table, the search for a real path to peace and integrity at Manori has never felt more urgent.